We sometimes forget just how fortunate we are to live in a world so full of wonderful and accessible technologies, and don't realize how hard those before us had it. Here, we'll explore some inventions that sparked revolutions that changed how we get things done. Inventions that altered the world and gave us the advantages we have today. Kick back, relax, and enjoy Inventions That Changed Everything. 11. Electricity. So, harnessing electricity is obviously one of the most important leaps humanity has made, as nearly everything we utilize today has at least an electrical component or two. Of course, it's always been there, but finding ways to capture and use it, which we've only been able to do for around 250 years, truly revolutionized the world we live in. Of course, there was Benjamin Franklin, whose experiments with electricity led the way into the field, but it wasn't until 1831, when Michael Faraday figured out the basic principles governing the generation of electricity, that things began to take shape. He figured out electromagnetic induction, which is still used today, by moving magnets inside of coils made of copper wire, which produced electricity. It is from Faraday's experiments that we gained insight into harnessing electricity, and it will forever be one of humankind's most significant accomplishments. 10. The light bulb. Speaking of harnessing electricity, we figured now's a good time to bring up the light bulb. Our attempts at producing viable light bulbs began back in the early 1800s with Humphrey Davy, but it wasn't until 1879 that light bulbs became a feasible thing on a commercial scale. Thomas Edison and his group of engineers made it all happen when they tested carbonized bamboo filaments in their bulbs, and boy did it work. Edison had already filed a patent for a light bulb using a carbon filament. He just hadn't figured out how to make it work yet, and when they came upon the carbonized bamboo filament, they realized that it could last more than 1,200 hours, and the rest, as they say, is history. 9. Steel. Nowadays, steel is one of the most trusted and used materials in building pretty much anything, but steel hasn't always been around. In fact, modern steel is a fairly new invention, relatively speaking. There were steels in ancient times, don't get us wrong, though the steels produced for things like swords and armor back then were nowhere near as refined and tough as the steels of today. Our modern steel got its start with the Bessemer process in 1855, which is named after Henry Bessemer, an English inventor. At the time, steel was mainly made from pig iron, and the introduction of Bessemer's process allowed for the production of large quantities of the metal for cheap. The mild steel produced quickly replaced wrought iron in most things. Several more processes in steelmaking, which expanded on the Bessemer process, were introduced throughout the early to mid-20th century. Although things are much different today than they were back then. Steel revolutionized building, and we have Henry Bessemer to thank for its advancement. 8. The telegraph. What if we didn't have ways to communicate across any type of distance today? The telegraph played a pretty pivotal role in changing the way we send messages and talk to each other, although even this now seemingly primitive technology didn't even become a thing until the 1830s and 40s. There were early versions of the telegraph, but the first recorded electric telegraph was designed by Samuel Morse and was patented in 1837. Alfred Vail, Morse's assistant, invented what is called a register, which recorded the messages received by Morse's machine. Both Vail and Morse worked out a system of dots and dashes that stood for all the letters of the alphabet, which we know as the Morse code. On January 11, 1838, the first ever telegram was sent in the US across a distance of 2 miles. The second telegram, which is often attributed as the first, was sent on May 24, 1844, and read, "What God hath wrote." Such was the beginning of the long-distance communication we have today. 7. The printing press. In a world before social media, television, and pretty much any other form of mass communication, the printing press is how the world received on a large scale. There were early forms of printed material. The first known printed book was the Diamond Sutra, a Buddhist book from China produced in 868 AD. It was created using meticulously carved backwards letters on blocks of wood, which were then stamped onto paper to create the print. This was revolutionized on a small scale by Bai Sheng, who developed movable type, which utilized movable, reusable letters carved into clay and then attached to an iron frame. The big revolution came in about 1440 with Johannes Gutenberg, a goldsmith and craftsman, who made his type from metals rather than wood, and even made his own ink to make it work. His invention made the circulation of information easy, and it was referred to as an agent of change. By 1500, Gutenberg presses were found all over Europe, and by 1600, they'd aided in creating more than 200 million books. 6. Batteries. What would we do without battery power? Our remotes and computers would probably have to be hooked into walls. Thanks to Alessandro Volta, we don't have to worry about any of that nonsense. Volta first came to ponder the battery following an observation noticed by a fellow scientist, Luigi Galvani. Galvani was dissecting a frog, and that was attached a brass hook in 1780, when the leg of the frog twitched after he touched an iron scalpel to the leg. Galvani called it animal electricity, but Volta came to another conclusion. He thought the twitch was the result of an electric current that happened when the moist intermediary joined two different metals. Volta produced a battery called the voltaic pile in 1800, and it was the first ever true battery invented. He used copper and zinc discs, which were stacked alternately, and then were joined, or separated, by a layer of either brine-soaked cardboard or cloth. It produced a stable current and continuous electricity, and later designs could create sparks and power a number of apparatuses. 5. Railways. Imagine if we'd stuck with just horses and buggies back in the day, and nobody had dreamt up a faster form of transportation a couple of hundred years ago. Sure, there were wagonways between 1500 to 1800 in Europe, but those were used in mining and didn't really take people from point A to point B. A rail line called the Middleton Railway in Leeds, West Yorkshire, England, was made of wood rails and was built in 1758. Then, metal rails were introduced in the late 1760s, but it wasn't until 1820 that wrought iron rails replaced the cast iron that was being used early on, which was prone to breaking and deformation. Then, along came the Bessemer process, which we discussed earlier, and that changed everything for the railway industry. The inexpensively made steel produced using Bessemer's process helped rail lines last longer and made heavier trains possible, which paved the way for steam locomotives. 4. Airplanes. What would we do without planes? Travel great distances across the land in trains and then sail across the ocean on ships? The idea for flying machines has been around for a long time. In more primitive times, people would try strapping bird-like wings on themselves or mount very basic flying machines and test them by jumping from towers or cliffs. And as you can probably guess, it didn't go so well. Even Leonardo da Vinci dreamt up his own flying machines, and by looking at his drawings, one can compare them to modern-day airborne vehicles. But it wasn't until Orville and Wilbur Wright took to the skies on December 17, 1903, in their Wright Flyer 1, that things literally took off. They'd built their plane by hand and tested it themselves, and they have been generally credited as creating the first successful airplane in the world. Everything since followed in their footsteps, and they paved the way for the air travel we have today. 3. Automobiles. As many of us can attest to, automobiles are fairly essential to the way we live our lives, as without them, most of us could not be as productive nor live the lives we live. The whole shebang began long ago when Carl Benz laid out the groundwork for the modern car, when he built the Benz patent motor car in 1885. He got his patent for it in 1886, and it took the world by storm. But the automobiles produced by Benz, and many who followed him, were far too expensive for most anybody to buy. This left the door open, and a man named Henry Ford stepped through it. Ford managed to come up with the Model T after trying 8 other models before it, but when the now famous T arrived, with a price accessible to consumers, the world of automobiles wholly changed. He pioneered the industry and even came up with methods of mass production not seen before. Automobiles are one of the greatest inventions of the recent past. They revolutionized everything and are essential to the world as we now know it. 2. Vaccines. Now, this one seems especially important because before vaccines, when epidemics hit, they hit hard and they killed a lot of people. An English scientist and physician, Edward Jenner, was the first person to make a vaccine, and it was to combat smallpox. The words vaccination and vaccine come from the Latin variola vaccina, which translates to smallpox of the cow, a term that Jenner came up with to describe cowpox. His understanding of the observations of others, that milkmaids who had cowpox did not contract smallpox, led him to the development of the revolutionary vaccine. Jenner himself inoculated several people with his newfound vaccine, including a young boy named James Phipps, the first to receive the vaccine, and was the son of his gardener, and even his own 11-month-old son. After the subject's initial mild bout with the infectious cowpox, he'd inject them with variolous material from smallpox patients on more than one occasion to see if they reacted. They did not. The vaccine took a while to get accepted, but in 1840, the British government issued a vaccination using cowpox, and they did so for free. Jenner initiated vaccines, and he no doubt helped to save literal countless millions of lives in doing so. We've seen some truly innovative and amazing technologies that have shaped the world today, and we still have one more to go. But first, we'd like to ask, what do you consider to be the greatest invention of all time? It's okay if it didn't make our list. We'd love to gain ideas for future videos, so leave your favorites in the comments below. 1. The computer. The analytical engine, widely considered the world's first computer, was the brainchild of Charles Babbage, an English polymath. The machine was only proposed though, as Babbage never successfully got one built due to problems with funding and various conflicts with his chief engineer. The design included integrated memory, a control flow, and an arithmetic logic unit, which made it the first ever general-purpose computer designed that could be called Turing complete. Babbage did manage to partially build his machine before passing away in 1871. In 1878, his plans for the analytical engine were called a marvel of mechanical ingenuity by a committee of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, although one was never produced. Babbage did, however, build what was called a difference engine, the predecessor to the analytical engine, that worked as an automatic mechanical calculator and was basically a simpler mechanical computer. He is credited as having first come up with the notion of a digital programmable computer, as all essential ideas which are found in modern computers can too be found in the analytical engine. This idea, this wonderful idea, has since carried along and has shaped the entire world of today. Without computers, technology would be inching along rather than leaping, and that makes it one of the top, if not the top, invention of all time. If this video helped you to appreciate the technologies we have today, do us a favor and give it a like. Subscribe to our channel so that you never miss any of our excellent uploads, and check out this next video we picked out just for you.